Well, ladies and gents, I think we are officially in the twilight years of console gaming. I hope I'm wrong, but it ain't looking too good for our favorite little lunchboxes these days. It really makes me sad. I know PC gamers are jostling their soy-filled bellies in laughter, but damn it, these little things had so much personality. They defined their retrospective generations and were huge stepping stones, not in just gaming, but in hardware. With the absolute garbage that is this current generation, and the price of skyrocketing, I highly doubt we'll have console gaming for too much longer. So I'd like to shine a light in these adorable little time wasters. The history, the games, my personal connection with them, and of course,
Aesthetic.
yes, I'm not just looking at the games, but I'm looking for their vibe. Which of these were the cool older friend that you know you would get in trouble if you were caught hanging out with? And which were the autistic cousin that never stopped showing you his Sonic action figures that smelled like shrimp and cigarettes? I was that cousin, by the way, but moving on. So please join me in this really long series I'm going to attempt that of the time of writing, I still don't have a name for it yet. I might just call it Dump Ass. Like, what's stopping me? Nobody watches this shit anyway. I could call this thing whatever I want. I have free will. P.S. Thank you for watching. Okay, so console gaming definitely didn't start with the NES. A lot of lore happened in between the NES and Pong, but honestly for me, gaming officially started with the NES. I might get hate for that, but I don't know. I don't mess with all that beep and boop shit. I'm a filthy millennial. I need a bit more than this. Shout out to all my old heads out there. Who knows, maybe one day I'll cover it, but for now, I want to start with the granddaddies themselves, the N-word. Nintendo. Before they were the harbingers of death and despair, Nintendo was a scrappy little entertainment company that experimented with all kinds of tech and came up with some pretty cool little gadgets and gizmos. In the 70s into the 80s, gaming was very rarely done in homes. There were these little things called arcades, where you go with your friends to play arcade games till dark. Can I just say that I am so jealous of all of you Chads that grew up with arcades? I grew up in bumfuck nowhere, so I had zero arcade experience as a kid. You see, nobody really made arcade cabinets like Nintendo. The In Squad made some absolute bangers that kept kids huddled around the machines for days. The biggest was, of course, Donkey Kong and its sequels absolutely dominated arcades around the world, eating up little Timmy's allowance every weekend. At this point in time, Nintendo was just making shit. They were inventing more than Jimmy Neutron. They made clocks, packages of rice, a taxi service. Hell, they even had some involvement in love hotels. Yes, Nintendo helped create hotels specifically made for sex. Where did that Nintendo go? Where's my Mario OnlyFans, damn it? These guys were making all kinds of stuff. They eventually had the idea of bringing arcade games into your living room. You want to play Donkey Kong and Mario Bros. In your own home? You want to completely hog the TV while your dad misses the baseball game he's been waiting to see? Well, here you go. Nintendo's first home console was the one, the only, Color TV Game 6. Okay, so they released a lot of these little crap-ass color TV things that were never released outside of Japan. They were made for one game, and they were crazy expensive, so nobody really remembers these. The real first kind of console they released was the iconic, the voluptuous Nintendo Entertainment System. The NES, also known as the Famicom Disk System in Japan, released in 1983. You see, our beloved medium was in a bit of a crisis at the time. The infamous video game crash loomed over the industry. It was just getting too expensive to make and sell video games. Also, the games just looked like this. Like, what the fuck? People stopped paying a fortune to spend 3 hours setting these things up and playing them for an hour and then getting bored by them. It just wasn't feasible anymore. Nintendo brought the same energy to their consoles as their arcade cabinets, not focusing on complicated mechanics or story. They just wanted to make fun and accessible games that even your mom could play. One thing that immediately set the NES apart was its controller. At the time, home console controllers tried to mimic the arcade sticks, to mixed results. Nintendo were so savvy that they created directional buttons that are still being used to this very day. That's impressive. I know they're not the first ones to come up with a D-pad, but they were the first ones to mainstream it for sure. You no longer had to play with this ball gag on a stick that barely worked. If you wanted the character to go right, you hit the right button, and it worked. And there she is, this big fucker herself. It fits snugly right next to your VCR. It's pretty thick by today's standards, but she's pretty cute. She's definitely the BBW of the Nintendo consoles. The Japanese version, the Famicom, looked a little different, going for a more slim design. I like the American NES design a bit more, just because it looks a bit more futuristic to me. And there's like actual piss-colored versions of the Famicom, so yeah, not a fan of that. Over its lifespan, the NES had some serious heavy hitters, along with some not heavy hitters. But this thing was a gigantic success, selling over 60 million units worldwide. Nintendo really saved the day with the NES. And who knows where gaming would even look like, or if it even exists nowadays without the NES. So why was this thing so revolutionary? The tech, the aesthetic, the convenience, all of that would mean nothing without the games. Let's take a look at these 10 games in release order to see how these gems gave this console its identity and how they revolutionized gaming. When arcades were all the rage, gaming was in such a different place. It was high score based. The goal was to beat your friend's high score, and now that your games were in your home, it was a little different. Beating scores would definitely get old after a while. You had the same game forever now, so just doing the same thing over and over started to become a drag. Nintendo understood that they would have to innovate. In 1983, Nintendo released the NES along with Super Mario Bros., and the world changed. Wars were ended, your parents got back together, racism was no more, everyone was united. This game almost single-handedly saved this medium from certain doom. You see, the biggest innovation with this game was that right there. You see that? Did you miss it? You see, when Mario went to the right of the screen, it moved with him. He didn't reappear on the other side of the screen. I know that this wasn't the first side-scroller ever, but it was 100% the most realized and polished version to that point. This is when games changed from a few minutes of dopamine hits to feeling like an actual adventure that was worth your time. It had the same Nintendo energy where it was super easy to pick up and play, but it had deceptively challenging gameplay. The controls were tight, it felt great to play, and it was just a blast. The icing on the cake was how weird and abstract the actual world of Mario felt. The art of Yoshi Kotabe really helped give this world so much personality. I feel like this guy's work went really underappreciated. Before Gotabe, Mario's artwork was agreeable. It harkened back to the look of old Rubber Hose cartoons. Miyamoto might have originally designed Mario, but Kotabe really brought out the specific Japanese quirk that Nintendo would later be known for. This guy's design of Mario is so good that it hasn't changed since. One of the most iconic characters in pop culture history, and I very rarely hear this guy's name. It's kind of a shame. The impact that this game had was just absolutely unprecedented. It truly was the video game of all time. Never before had a video game impacted the zeitgeist in this way before. When even your mom is wearing a Mario shirt, you know it was big. There really isn't much I can say about this game that hasn't already been said. It's arguably the most iconic game of all time and is still, to this day, an incredibly fun game that's aged gracefully, and I would recommend this game to just about anyone. It's pretty hard to have a bad time with this game, and it set the standard. If you ask me, this is where gaming truly began. You see, Nintendo was by no means a one-trick pony. Mario represented a change. It made people look at gaming totally different and opened a ton of possibilities. How the hell can you follow that up? Apparently by making another absolute game changer. The Legend of Zelda was released on February 21st, 1986. The Legend of Zelda defied all expectations and gave players a whole new world to explore. No other game before Zelda just gave you an open world like this before. Every inch of this world is covered with just shit happening, and it's totally up to the player to find it. You're dropped into the world, given a sword, and you're off. Want to clear a dungeon? Want to grind for rupees? Want to try to find all the fairies? It's all up to you. The absolute sense of freedom and discovery that this game provided was unheard of. The non-linear world gave this game so much scope, and it felt like a truly open world at the time. Forests, mountains, rivers, dank dungeons, it was all here, and it was so seamless. There have been dungeon crawlers before this game, but it never felt this seamless, fun, and simple to pick up. Where you could say that Mario was the first true platformer, you could say that The Legend of Zelda was the first true open world adventure game. The little secrets and details that the game had really made it feel like it was your own personal adventure. And the game just felt epic. Felt like an epic adventure that was your own. No NES collection would be complete without The Legend of Zelda. It was another absolute massive W for Nintendo and gave birth to one of the most beloved and enduring franchises that this industry has ever seen. At this point, Nintendo was seen as quite child-friendly and fun for all ages kind of vibe. While Zelda may have been enjoyed by slightly older kids than Mario, it was still seen as pretty safe entertainment for children. I think Nintendo was interested in attracting maybe a little slightly older kids at this time. That sounds a little weird. Metroid was the answer. Metroid was a darker, harder, more brutal game with a distinct horror influence. While Metroid might have not absolutely annihilated like Mario and Zelda did, it still has its place in history. Much like Zelda, Metroid provided a non-linear progression experience with different upgrades and bosses. However, unlike Zelda, this was much more isolating and atmospheric. The horror aesthetic really gives this game so much personality and probably scared a lot of kids. There's some legit creepy imagery in this. The balls on Nintendo to release 2 child-friendly games in a row and then basically release a straight-up horror game is pretty crazy. I mean, like, this is scary as about a fart nowadays, but this imagery was pretty intense, especially compared to Mario and Zelda. Multiple playthroughs were encouraged, and it was so satisfying figuring out item placements and level design to truly master the game. To top it off, this game had something that few other games had before. Boobies. That's right, you could play it and you could goon to it. Of all the studios to be progressive, fucking Nintendo was actually pretty ahead of the time with this. Most of gaming was tailored to little boys, and getting them to play as a girl was a hard sell. But Nintendo saved the reveal to the very end of the game, and it was fucking genius. With obvious alien-inspired aesthetic, it would make sense that the main character would be a badass alien-slaying heroine. Metroid was yet another reason to have an NES. All in all, it was finally starting to look up for video games. Nintendo was exactly what everyone needed, but it would come with a price. You see, there was pretty much zero competition at this point. Nintendo was just leaps and bounds better than everyone else. If you wanted a game, it kinda just had to be on Nintendo. Healthy competition is very important for a thriving industry, and Nintendo were just top dogs for a while. It was hard to complain when Nintendo were releasing absolute bangers like Metroid. Metroid was yet another genre-defining title that furthered not just Nintendo, but gaming as a whole. Yet another dub for Nintendo. So sequels were a bit of an uncharted territory in games, and Nintendo was a forward-thinking company. They don't just want to make the same thing again. Zelda 2 was an experience. You're still going around a fantasy world killing monsters, clearing dungeons, but instead of a seamless world and combat, the game is slightly segmented. When in combat, the game changes from a top-down view to a 2D perspective, a feature that would never cross over into future games, if you don't count these. Not only that, but new RPG mechanics that were also never carried over from past games was introduced to rather polarizing reactions. While the first game was an action-adventure game, this one was more an action RPG that took a lot of people off guard. That being said, there are a few things that were introduced in Zelda 2 that would become staples, such as the emphasis on NPCs and the introduction of side quests. Zelda 2 released to overall praise and accolades, but it wasn't quite the same earth-shattering response as the first game. Even though this game felt a little different than its predecessors, it was still pretty hard to hate a game with this much personality. The weird gameplay quirks and odd side characters led to a really charming and unique little game here. This game feels like hanging out with your funny, kind of off-putting uncle. By no means a bad time, you just wish your uncle would stop saying slurs and licking his lips loudly. While not quite capturing the same magic as the first, Zelda 2 left a rather unique legacy. It's remembered for its quirk, frustration, but ultimately good time, and it furthered Nintendo's reign as the champions of fun. So at this point, Nintendo was just out of control. Never before or since has a single entity had complete stranglehold on the gaming industry. If you were going to game, it had to be on Nintendo. They were really the only ones to have a real grasp of quality control. Nintendo even made the seal of approval, signifying that the game you were playing was indeed a real game and not some old crackhead schizophrenia simulator. You see, Nintendo didn't create every single game for this thing. Most of the NES library were actually third-party releases by different studios, and one of those studios being Squaresoft. While releasing one or two minor hits in Japan, Squaresoft had also released several flops in a row that never made it out of Japan. Times were tough at Square, and they were facing a full-on collapse. So much so that it would actually impact the title of their upcoming game, signifying the final chance they had of making this thing work. Inspired by the Dragon Quest series, they wanted to try their hands at an RPG. You see, RPGs have been a thing well before video games. Think Dungeons & Dragons, but in electronic form. Final Fantasy was created in 1987 and was an immediate hit, a genre-defining game that introduced mechanics that would be a staple in the genre going forward. The different classes and races made this game feel like a proper Dungeons & Dragons game. The turn-based combat gave players exciting and strategic experience, elevated by cool characters and story. The focus on vehicles and exploration was so novel, and it made it feel like a true odyssey. This game would be the first entry in an absolute powerhouse franchise that is still going strong to this very day. Final Fantasy would be yet another reason to own the NES, providing a sophisticated and unique RPG experience that you couldn't get anywhere else. In the mid-80s, games were shifting from arcades to home consoles, and the modest gaming studio known as Capcom were making that transition as well. Primarily focusing on NES ports of their arcade machines, they wanted to develop a gaming icon that was specifically made for the home console market. Rockman was conceived and released in 1987 to rave reviews. Renamed to Mega Man around the world, it didn't matter what this game was called, this game slapped, giving players a balls-to-the-wall action platforming experience that was as much fun as it was extremely challenging. Mega Man may have had a child-friendly appearance, but this game was deceptively challenging, and it took a lot of skill and level memorization to beat. Not only that, but ending every level with a crazy hard boss fight. What made Mega Man truly unique was that it wasn't necessarily a linear experience. You could play Mega Man in any order you want. At the end of every boss, you receive the boss's specific power-up. Every boss had a weakness to a specific power-up, but it was up to the player to figure that out. This game had a ton of replayability and gave players freedom to the way they wanted to play it. While critically well received, the game didn't sell as well as Capcom hoped. They reluctantly greenlit a sequel, but the developers weren't given as much time to work on the game, treating it as a side project. But creativity comes from limitation, ladies and gents. Mega Man 2 released a year later, and it was an absolute masterpiece. Releasing to near perfect scores around the board, it wasn't even that much different from the OG, but it felt so much more refined and crafted to perfection. The difficulty was scaled down slightly, and the levels and boss fights were just better. I can't really think of a better way to describe it. This game is so good and would set the standard for the entire series to this day. you know something is special when the formula has deviated so little but still works. As this video series goes on, I will be giving my personal experience more and more. I just didn't grow up that much with the NES, but I did actually grow up with Mega Man. Mega Man 2 is my absolute favorite NES game, and every now and then I'll get an itch to just load up Mega Man 2 and just blast through it and have an absolute blast of a time. Mega Man is one of my favorite IPs, and Mega Man 2 has a lot to do with that. I play this game at least once or twice a year, and is absolutely my favorite NES game of all time, bar none. Mega Man 1 and 2 are still considered absolute seminal landmarks in gaming history, and spawn a ton of sequels on the NES. I don't want to focus too much on how well a game has aged or not in this series, but I will say that I think Mega Man 2 has aged the best out of any NES game. Yes, even Mario. I'd recommend everyone to try out Mega Man 2 still to this day. It is still that good. Gaming and horror seem to go together like peanut butter and jelly. Even though horror games were a thing since gaming was a thing, it was pretty rare to find a horror game on Nintendo. Even though Metroid had a lot of horror elements, mainly in tone, it was still pretty tame, all things considered. Another Japanese developer, Konami, wanted to make a horror game that harkened to classic Hollywood horror films. Classic films such as Dracula, Frankenstein, The Wolfman, and Phantom of the Opera would be inspirations for this new action horror game. In 1986, Castlevania was released, and of course, it was an instant classic. Castlevania wasn't just a platformer, it was a platforming action game, and it felt absolutely incredible. The precise, difficult combat was nothing short of revolutionary, not to mention the incredible graphics and killer music. The game was less about child-friendly fun and more about overcoming the odds stacked against you. The game had rather terrifying aesthetics for the time and probably scared a bunch of kids. Furthermore, the atmosphere of this game absolutely seeped out of your television. While the game was ball-bustingly hard, it was very rarely unfair. You couldn't just mindlessly play Castlevania. You had to meet it on its own terms, and victory was only possible through perseverance and memorization. The weapons and controls legit felt so good that there was little competition. Hitting shit with your whip still to this day feels so good. This game has absolutely stood the test of time and gave the NES so much more personality. Castlevania 3 actually being my second favorite NES game of all time. The legacy of this game and franchise could not be understated. There's not really a ton more I could add. James Rolfe has an incredible retrospective that I'm sure most everyone has seen, but still, if you haven't seen it, definitely check that out. And if you really want to know more and have nearly 8 hours to spare, my boy, I Finished a Video Game has a 7.5-hour documentary on the legacy of Castlevania, and it's an absolute banger, so you should definitely watch that. I'm actually slightly cheating for this one. The game I'm talking about didn't originally release for the NES, but it had a very popular port that still has its own legacy. At this point, Nintendo just kept collecting W after W, and they weren't stopping anytime soon. Eventually, they came back to the idea they had years ago before the NES released, this thing called a Game & Watch. The Game & Watch was a handheld game. Yes, not plural, a handheld game. These games had one specific game for each model. Now that technology advanced, they wanted to try their hand on handheld gaming again. The Game Boy was released in 1989, and it was a far cry from the Game & Watch. While they weren't as impressive as actual NES games, Game Boy games weren't too far off. Maybe one day I'll do a video about the Game Boy, but for now I just want to focus on the NES. A Russian developer named this name that I'm definitely going to butcher if I say, basically went through some Walter White shit to get this game made. It's a long story, and this video is long enough. If you're curious, go watch the Apple TV show. It's actually pretty fascinating. Basically, this guy went through hell to release a game called Tetris, and it would all be worth it. Tetris was released in 1988 and absolutely set the world on fire. Never had a game been so easy to pick up and so hard to put down. This game was like a drug. It was definitely the puzzle game of all time. It really is kind of surprising how big this game got, considering how primitive it is nowadays. Maybe it's just because I'm a nasty millennial. primitive or not, this game would eventually see an NES port, and this game is still going strong to this day. This game is kind of a huge rabbit hole, and I would definitely recommend looking into it. The history and legacy of this game is honestly kind of more interesting than the game itself, in my personal opinion. Even though it wasn't initially released on the NES, Tetris had a gigantic impact and is a staple of the third generation of gaming, a legacy game that still continues to this day. While Nintendo kept innovating with each new game, the one game that endured the most was the original Super Mario Bros. And while there was a sequel, it was a bit of a black sheep. Similar to Zelda 2, Mario 2 deviated from the original and almost felt like a completely different game. While Nintendo did make a sequel to the original Super Mario Bros., it was seen as too derivative and hard, and they didn't release it outside of Japan initially. The actual Super Mario Bros. 2 we got was actually a totally different game called Doki Doki Panic, just with Mario skin over it. The reason why I didn't cover this game is because that game didn't really leave that big of an impact, and I don't really think too highly of this game, to be honest. It definitely feels like a step backwards from the first Super Mario Bros. While it was a significant improvement on the technical side, the game was a lot more of a slog than the first. It just doesn't really feel like a Mario game. Well, because it isn't. Super Mario Bros. 3 was conceptualized as a true sequel to the original. None of the picking shit up and throwing crap or using magic doors. It was back to classic Mario, just more. At this point in time, Mario was gigantic. The hype for this game was absolutely out of control and somehow against all odds. Not only did it meet every single expectation, it surpassed it. Super Mario Bros. 3 released in 1988 to perfect 10 out of 10 scores. Some even hailing it as the single greatest video game of all time. It really is hard to state how much this game slapped tits. It dwarfed Mario 1 in size and scope. It was as close to an absolute perfect game as games got at this point. It was so well realized and ahead of its time that this game is widely considered the greatest NES game of all time. While it's actually my third favorite NES game of all time, it's not far behind Castlevania or Mega Man 2 at all. This game is still a blast, and once in a blue moon, I'll pop this bad boy in and get my Mario on. Fuck you, Luigi. The world was bigger, there were more diverse levels, level design was better, boss fights were better, and most importantly, the best controls in the console history. Playing this game feels orgasmic. The controls are so tight that it feels like anything is possible. The controls were so good that it set the standard for the old Italian fart smeller. Every subsequent Mario title would receive the same level of quality in the controls. It would become a core staple for the franchise. There truly was no other game that came even close to the insanity that was Mario 3. It was an epic adventure that changed games forever. The amount of actual content of this game was staggering, and all of it was still super fun and so insanely memorable. How do you do this? How do you make Super Mario Bros. 3 in 1988? Like, how does that happen? Super Mario Bros. 3 wasn't just better than the original. It grabbed the original by the tail and flung it into a bomb and says, "So long, gay Super Mario Bros. 1983 for the Nintendo Entertainment System." This game is a timeless classic that is still hard to resist 37 years later, and it would be the foundation for things to come in the future. Alright, so that does it for the games. These were 10 games that I thought represented the console the most. I know there are some other gems that I haven't mentioned, so sound off in the comments on which NES games you love the most. The NES represented a huge checkpoint for games. It was the savior that everyone needed and rescued the medium from the bowels of oblivion. During its golden age, every single year, a genre-defining game released and blew people away, and kept people coming back for more and more. After the NES, there was no doubt. The gaming medium was here, and here to stay, baby. Now, let's move on to the aesthetics. Look, 1980s nostalgia is a thing. I know everyone is sick to death of this style, and honestly I am too, but it's kind of hard to see why the 80s aesthetic is so beloved. It was a time of hope and optimism for the future. Emphasis on future. This was the era of Star Wars, and it infected everything. Every little thing looked like a fucking spaceship, including the NES. The NES had this fat cabinet design that was oh so popular in the 80s. It wasn't as big as a VCR, but it was close. The color scheme was rather scaled back, with whites and grays and blacks. The controller had largely the same color scheme, but the face buttons were so beautiful. The red colors contrasted beautifully with the black and gray. And just look at these buttons, they're so pressable. Those are some Dexter's Lab ass looking buttons. The Famicom's look was definitely more compact, but I think it's a little hideous. I like the use of reds, but I don't know, it just looks like a flip-flop to me. The NES vibe just kind of reminds me of that Eric Andre sketch. Now, I could be wrong, but I feel like this was one of the first times that a medium was almost exclusively developed by Japan and exposed a lot of Americans to Japanese art and their sensibilities. Not to mention, it was primarily marketed to children, so we got some interesting commercials and ads for this thing. Over the years, Nintendo released some pretty cool add-ons like the Zapper, the Power Glove, and Rob the Cuck-Ass Robot that barely worked. Cut them some slack though, Nintendo was still figuring out their accessories. When I think of the NES nowadays, I think of a cozy room with a brown carpet, bookshelves filled with retro games, and a CRT TV from the 80s right in the middle. To me, the NES represents the pure optimism surrounding the tech. Tech was becoming more and more available to everyone, and this medium had such a resurgence that the sky was the limit, and the NES was the conduit for creativity and adventure. Nintendo really just created an absolute cavalcade of amazing games that made everyone a gamer. Just think about this for a second. People didn't refer to this hobby as video games back in the day. They called it Nintendo. Nintendo was so synonymous with video games that people actually called the entire medium by the distributors. They wouldn't say I'm playing a video game. They would say I'm playing Nintendo. It's like when people called all sodas Coke back in the day. It really is the best case scenario business-wise. So with that, the NES marked its place in the history books, and absolutely nobody could stop them. And then it happened. A new challenger approached. An adversary that would create something that would change everything. Something that would affect generations to come. They created autism.